This is KCSB FM Santa Barbara 91.9 on your dial, and let me say www.kcsb.org/listen on the web. You're listening to No Alibis, and I'm Elizabeth Robinson.
And I'm Avery Gordon, and I am very pleased to welcome Dr. Rafal Pankowski, head of the Never Again Association in Warsaw, Poland's leading anti-racist organization and the author of The Populist Radical Right in Poland, and also Liz Fekete, director of the Institute of Race Relations in London and author of Europe's Fault Lines, Racism and the Rise of the Right. They have both taken time out of their very busy schedules to discuss what is happening in the Ukraine in a wider sort of EU, Eastern European context. And we hope to focus with them, especially on the role of far-right groups, racism, and so on. So again, thank you both for being here and making time. I wanted to start with you, Rafal, since you're on the ground. The UN is reporting more than 2 million refugees have fled Ukraine, many to Poland, of course. So tell us about what's happening, what you're concerned about. We've all heard about the racist treatment of African students at the borders. Liz tells me you've also been collecting information on far-right attacks against African refugees. So start where you will about what we should know.
Well, thank you for having me. It is quite difficult, frankly speaking, to discuss about events which are happening, here and now as we speak. You see, for more than 25 years, I've been a member of an organization called Never Again. And of course, the phrase never again has a lot of different meanings in different places. It also has a very special meaning in Polish history and in the history of the region of Central and Eastern Europe. And we spent those years warning against xenophobia, racism, nationalism. But I think none of us honestly anticipated that, we would be talking about a major war in our region, in our immediate neighborhood. And of course, the tragedy has different aspects and different levels, but obviously the refugee situation is one of them. And like you said, it's probably more than 2 million people who left Ukraine in little more than a week. I think the figure in Poland is now close to 1.5 million. There are also other countries such as Moldova that is not talked about as much, but relatively speaking, Moldova got even more refugees, compared to the size of the country. But in the context of such a tragedy, I think that we can actually talk about something that's positive, at least in a way, and that is what I think is the very real, very genuine wave of sympathy and solidarity with the refugees in Poland. And I think just a few weeks ago, it's something that we would not have expected, because as you may well know, for the last 5-7 years. There was very little acceptance of refugees in Poland, both on the level of government as well as attitudes in society. And I think that in some ways has changed. Well, of course, we can ask whether this change is long-term or not. But I think there is a lot of goodwill, and a lot of it comes from the grassroots, from civil society, also local government. And there are thousands and thousands of Polish people who are offering their homes, their cars, their time to assist the Ukrainian volunteers. Well, like you alluded to, quite a few of the refugees from Ukraine are non-Ukrainian or non-European. For example, African or Asian students who happened to be in Ukraine when the war broke out, and they also wanted to get out. And unfortunately, what we also witnessed was some far-right groups mobilizing against non-white refugees and even inciting violence that took place in the border region. And I think what's important to note in this context is also the responsibility of the biggest social media platforms that enabled the disinformation and the incitement against the non-European refugees coming from Ukraine, which resulted in violence very, very soon. So obviously the situation is very dramatic. It's very dynamic, and we will see what happens next.
Avery, did you want to go ahead?
Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Okay. Well, I think I just for a moment would like to go to a bit broader frame and partly to bring Liz into the conversation, because at the Institute of Race Relations that I knew for a very long time, it was assumed that race and racism was fairly limited, that it was focused on people of color from the global south, etc. And I think it was not an overstatement to say that Liz Fekete had a particular view of Europe and Eastern Europe, maybe in the breakup of the Soviet Union and otherwise, as a site also of a different, perhaps, but surely a racism and heavy discriminatory reality. Can you say something about that, Liz?
Yeah, sure. Just to sort of roll back a bit and to respond to what Rafal has said as well, Elizabeth, if I may. I think that we've seen, since the war on terror, we've seen across Europe, and not just Eastern Europe, across the whole of Europe, a massive wave of Islamophobia. And that has been reflected in border policies. And in the context of Eastern Europe, of Poland, Hungary, I'm thinking of in particular, because these are the countries that I know best, there has been an unwillingness on the part of those countries to accept refugees in the past, if they are coming from what are perceived as Muslim or Arab regions of the world. And I mean, it's also been very dramatic in the last 2 weeks, as there has been a quite rightful wave of solidarity towards the refugees coming from Ukraine, that far-right leaders have reasserted their view that this is fine because they are like us, they are Christians, they are Europeans, and have further cemented the division between non-Europeans and Europeans. And so, I mean, we've seen, before this situation, this awful war, we had seen at the Poland-Belarus border, refugees from Syria, from Iraq, Afghanistan being driven back. We've seen the erections of walls and barriers against refugees from other parts of the world. I think none of this distracts from what Rafal has said, because just as the United States isn't Donald Trump, Poland isn't that. I mean, it has been amazing to see over the last months with the Polish-Belarus crisis. It's been amazing to see the response from ordinary Polish people to refugees from non-European parts of the world. I mean, in particular, the women's movement. We've seen grandmothers at the border saying, this isn't our Poland. So, sometimes this sort of complexity doesn't get into the discourse. So I think there's that I think that Rafal would probably want to speak more about as well. And I think, and the other thing with the far right groups that Rafal mentioned, and he's very, very humble man. I've known Rafal for 35 years. We first met each other as young sort of anti-race. Oh my God, it must be more than 30 years, Rafal. I think we were at a conference for young people. So goodness knows how long ago that was. So oh God, I've forgotten my train of thought with all these memories coming back. So anyway, what I'm trying to say is there is another Poland, and that other Poland was there before this crisis. It isn't the Poland of the far right. It isn't the Poland saying no Muslim refugees. So that was there. But, saying Rafal is modest because what he isn't saying was after the attacks on the African, and it wasn't just African students, it was Indian students as well. It was students from other parts of the world. I mean, he stayed up all night tracking social media and looking at videos to see who were the assailants. And I think what we know is that some of them are from a far-right group called Confederation. And actually, we've seen in recent weeks the Polish government rejecting attempts to stop their incitement on social media. This was before the Ukraine crisis. So that's one thing that I wanted to sort of throw into the pot. The second thing, which I think is very important for our discussion, and I think Rafal is right, it's very, very difficult to respond to events on the ground as they're happening in this awful war. But I think what I researched when I wrote my book, Europe's Fault Lines, was what in the Eastern European context, but also actually in the context of Spain, it's very similar, the rise of what are called memory wars. We talk about culture wars in the UK, and I know that you do that in the US as well, quite clearly a need because of the way that the right are pursuing culture wars. But I think in Eastern Europe, it's been very, very clear that the governments have also pursued their own memory wars. They're very hard right, far right governments around history, around trying to create a view of their history as one without blemish, so that elements to do with the Never Again story that Rafal is involved in were being manipulated so that Poland was out without blemish in terms of the Holocaust, in terms of anti-Semitism. Hungary was a country, without blemish. And I think these memory wars have also been there in the Ukraine, in all countries. So this is, I think, another factor that is in this war, which is actually it's so difficult to talk about because at the moment we're in a position where we're facing 2 million displaced people, and they are also women and children. They are not, they are not men, which also makes it easier for society to handle, if you like. So it makes it kind of difficult for us to discuss the fact that there has been racism, anti-Semitism in the whole region, Poland, Hungary, Ukraine, etc. It makes it difficult to discuss that at this current moment when in this war, Russia are the clear aggressors, and it was a war that should have never happened. But I'm just throwing all those things out for the discussion.
Yeah, so maybe we just let Rafal to reply
to
everything.
I couldn't agree more with what Liz has just said, and definitely this recent tragedy is happening at a time when we have been experiencing a crisis of democracy in the region anyway, in countries such as Poland and Hungary for the last years. And you see, I think one of the mistakes that was made back in the 90s on the part of what you may call the liberal elite was this assumption of so-called democratic transformation as a one-way process, as a one-way street from point A to point B. And I think already back in the 90s, we sort of warned against this assumption as too simplistic. And we already then talked about some threats to the democratic culture that appeared. And over the years, and especially in the last years, they became very mainstream. Those previously marginal far-right groups came very close to the centers of power in both Poland and Hungary. So my worry, one of my worries for the near future or the medium-term future is this. Well, with more than 1 million refugees already, there will be many more probably. There are 1 million Ukrainians in Poland already before the war started. I think this might be a community that's all too easy to be scapegoated. Well, currently we have this wave of enthusiasm and support, which is important and positive. But the question is, whether or not this enthusiasm and this goodwill will be sustainable for months or years. And already now we know that there are those groups, including those who incited the violence against non-white refugees. But the very same groups, we know for a fact, are just waiting for an opportunity to scapegoat the Ukrainians as well. So I'd like to stay optimistic on this front, but I think at the same time I'm also rather realistic about what the future will bring. So my worry would be that the far right will seize the opportunity with a big migration crisis, with a big crisis of refugee movement. They might use it in order to incite hatred against this new big group of victims of the war.
Well,
go ahead.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that's in effect what happened in Germany after Merkel opened the borders to Syrians. I mean, it did enable the neo-Nazi right there very much to consolidate certain positions. Can I ask? I just really want to ask an informational question, Rafal, just before we go back to any of the other deeper issues that you all put on the table, and that is whether you have seen any, or are you seeing any Russian soldiers who have fled the fighting, or the Russian anti-war dissidents, or from Belarus, where there's also been a terrible crushing of dissent as well. I mean, we're hearing about what's happening in Russia and Belarus to the anti-war dissidents, and a little bit here and there, some of the information is reliable, some of it isn't, about Russian soldiers abandoning their posts, their tanks, refusing to fight. Are you seeing any of those folks come in as refugees into Poland? And if so, do you know anything about that?
Well, I think you just mentioned something that's really very important, both for Russia and for the whole region and for the whole current situation. Well, there are some, Russian activists in democratic activists based in Poland. I'm not aware of new refugees in the last days. I would not be surprised if that also happens. But I think what's really important is to look out for news and information on on anti-war resistors inside of Russia today. And we have some evidence of protests across Russia. I think a lot of this information is actually suppressed. But I think it might be one of the most important aspects of the global situation today. And I think we should be thinking about giving as much support as possible to those brave people in Russia who protest against the war.
Yeah, there was quite a good piece posted on Open Democracy anonymously about the crushing and also the way in which the basically the criminalization and destruction of the opposition organizations have decentralized the anti-war opposition and how people are functioning in that context. Liz, please go ahead.
Yes. You're mute.
Yeah. Totally in agreement with Rafal's point. We actually share a lot of information together in a loose network of sort of anti-fascist researchers. And one of the things that really does upset me, talking also, broadening it out to what's happening across EU countries and in Western Europe, is the kind of hysteria about anything Russian. And, you know, you hear stories. There was a university in Milan that banned the teaching of Dostoevsky on a course, actually had to reverse that decision after a public outcry. And I was chatting to Rafal about this in our sort of chat group, and he said, well, very proudly, he's very proud that the Never Again Association are just going to publish a new translation of Gogol's Dead Souls. Perhaps he'd like to sort of tell us a bit more about that, because it's so important in the context of the multicultural roots of Central and Eastern Europe, you know, and the interlocking of all our cultures. So within this, we have in the sort of Western European countries this kind of like, or almost like knee-jerk cultural reaction, ban anything Russian, which is a hysteria that is worrying. And at the same time, we're not doing enough to recognize the importance of war resistors in Russia. So we share a lot of information about statements that are being put out by various professional bodies for peace, whether it's teachers, doctors. And we've seen the protests of young people in Russia. And, you know, this is also really, really important to keep in our mind, because the penalty for these protests are huge. So when we're talking about international solidarity, I think our international solidarity is both with the millions displaced. And, you know, at some point I'd like us to think about what happens to 2 million, mostly women and children, in an environment where sympathy can quickly change. But we also see that our duty is to support the anti-war resistors in Russia.
Thank you, Liz. Let me just take a moment to say it is 9:59 and you are tuned to KCSB FM Santa Barbara, 91.9 on your dial. I know in the first days of the Russian actions, there were some images on our televisions of protests in the streets of, I think it was Moscow, but I haven't seen anything much recently about that. So absolutely, if you have more on that, Rafal, please add it. But I'd like you also to say more about the role of social media, because of course that's a two-way street, and that's probably how we know what's been happening on the streets of Moscow at all. Sorry.
Well, as far as I know, those protests in Russia have continued across the country, including in the Far East, in Siberia, and places like Novosibirsk, for example. I remember the images I watched. So I think that has to be recognized. Whether or not those protests are significant enough to change the course of history is another question, of course. But I think it's really important to acknowledge they are happening. So some of this information is available on social media. At the same time, we do know that the Russian authorities tried to block or slow down some of the social media platforms for their own citizens. On the other hand, I have to say I am amazed. I already mentioned something about the responsibility of the big platforms for enabling some of the anti-refugee incitement in Poland, but also I'm surprised and disappointed. Some of the very vile pro-war propaganda is hosted on those platforms too. And I can give specific examples, but there may be not so important in terms of details. But let me just mention the name Alexander Dugin, who is the sort of number one ideologue of Russian fascism, who is very, very popular with white supremacist groups all over the world, and he's been churning out pro-war propaganda every day. And the last time I checked, he still had his Facebook page. So I think this question could be and should be asked about what do the biggest platforms do in response to such hateful propaganda on their own services.
Yeah, Avery, go ahead.
Yeah, I definitely hope we have time to get Liz also to make a comment about the reaction in the UK, because the IRR news statement about that is important, I think, for her to share. But I actually have a different question while we have Dr. Pankowski on with us from the Never Again Association, and that is if you might shed some light on how we should understand Putin's call for, quote, denazification. I think this is confusing to people and is partially being manipulated in all kinds of ways. And I wondered if you could speak to that a little bit, just how to understand what that means.
Okay, well, let me respond briefly. Let me start by saying the far right in Ukraine really exists. Okay, and even neo-Nazis in Ukraine, they exist. And it's not a good thing at all. Having said that, I think this discourse of so-called denazification on the part of the Russian president is completely unacceptable, and it's actually a sort of form of trivializing the whole issue and the whole memory of Nazism and victims of Nazism in World War II in Eastern Europe. So I think it's totally misplaced, and I don't even need to stress that the president of Ukraine is actually Jewish, and of course a lot of his supporters are definitely not neo-Nazis. So I think it's wrong. It's sort of morally unacceptable to use this kind of manipulative arguments, which are definitely out of place in the case of this conflict.
Liz, do you want to make any comment about that?
I'm fine on this, I think, yeah.
Okay.
I would just like to say one thing, because someone on this program a week or so ago also mentioned that the Ukrainian president was Jewish and therefore couldn't be a Nazi. I don't accept that. I think one can go in any number of places wherever one begins. But I take your point very, very well, Rafal. But I think in the next few minutes, we do want. I want to say one thing about the far right here, because people are mystified, sort of not on the left, but sort of liberals are really mystified about why the various white supremacist organizations here identify with Putin. And perhaps you'd like to say something about that. I will restrain myself, but please, why don't you go first, Rafal, if you'd like, and then we'll come back to Liz and also get you to talk about the Institute's work in this regard, in relation to the conflict.
Well, I think it's not just the US, and Liz might confirm if that's the case. I think also in Europe we have seen different reactions from the far right to this war. A big part of the far right has supported the war, the invasion against Ukraine. There are also sections of the far right that are very much on the Ukrainian side. So I think there is a lot of discussion and conflict within the international far right on that. But having said that, I think, and I don't want to sound simplistic, but what I think the far right often likes is the idea of killing people. And that's why they are okay and happy with a war of this type. And I think we have seen it in history in the previous decades too. But I think at the end of the day, the sort of idea of aggressive militarism is appealing to many of those white supremacist and far right groups everywhere.
Thanks.
Go ahead, Liz, please.
Just to respond to that question, Rafal is quite right. The support from the far right is in both towards both countries in the conflict. And in terms of the extreme right electoral parties around Europe, they have for long been very sort of pro-Putin. And we could also mention the fact that, certain governments have been quite happy to sort of cozy up to, Russian oligarchs, and actually any old oligarch from any old country. I mean, sometimes I wonder why all oligarchs are Russian. But yeah, and I mean, way before the conflict started, I mean, there's two things here. The extreme right parties like Putin in much of it, or they like Russia in much as the same way that they've allied themselves with Israel, in the sense that it's seen as a country that shows civilizational vigor. We had an article in one of our right-wing newspapers recently about almost like, it was saying almost something to the effect of, while Ukraine is standing up to Russia, all in the UK, but we are worried about is who's using which toilet, and actually turned it into attack on trans people. So on this block, the Putin admiring blocks, it's the civilizational vigor. He is a patriot, he's defending Greater Russia and what he believes in, while us Europeans are going down the drain because of all this multiculturalism and all these immigrants. That's the kind of argument. But there is another side of this as well, and this is where our limited understanding of history comes in. I've been frustrated in the last 2 weeks about how our understanding of this conflict is only in terms of Hitler equations or the Cold War, whereas the roots of this conflict are there much longer back than that. But the point that I'm trying to make is that there's an element of neo-Nazis who have joined with Ukrainian neo-Nazi militia before this conflict, because of the sort of anti-Russian element, which has always been there in neo-Nazism, because after all, Germany and
They've been
Hitler,
anti-communist, yeah.
anti-communist, but Germany and Hitler considered Russian people as backwards, as people who should, be the slaves and the serf of the great German Empire. So there's all these layers of things going on. So that's my contribution to that element of the conversation. Avery wanted to mention something about my own beloved country, the United Kingdom. Well, at the start of this conflict, we had a junior immigration minister in the Conservative Party who said, well, the Ukrainians can come under the seasonal work permit scheme. Basically, they can come and pick the crops. And that is the view of many European countries, of where Eastern Europeans, even if they're in the EU or not in the EU, fit within our labour market, which is why I'm very concerned about what will happen to 2 million women and children, because Eastern European women also face racism. They face xeno-racism. They face a racism which says that they are there as carers of the elderly, servants, domestic workers. There was something that sent a chill through me when I'm sure you saw this reported in the US, that you have this Brazilian Bolsonaro supporter who decided to have his photo taken supporting Ukrainian refugees, didn't realise he'd left his mic on or whatever it was that he left on, and was saying, wow, these women are goddesses. And what's more, they're poor, they're easy pickings. And, from everything we know about where Eastern European women fit within the European labour market and other markets, the situation isn't good. It's not good.
Yeah, thank you, Liz. I'm glad that you said that, because this is something that the IRR and you have been at the forefront of pointing out, this idea of xeno-racism. It's very much tied to Brexit and the terrible racism and xeno-racism against people from Poland, from Romania, etc., that we have been witnessing here. And so I think that everything you're saying is also a part of the expanded context that's been missing and suppressed, and particularly right now in the context of, the issue of who we're loyal to right now, and who we're supporting and who we're not. So, thank you for that. I think we're out of time.
Yes, we are. We are just about out of time, but I want to give each of you an opportunity for a final comment, and also if you like to mention someplace where you think there's good information to be had for listeners who might want to do it, or for organizations that they might want to support. Rafal, you want to begin? Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you again for having me, and I would simply encourage the listeners to check out the website of the Never Again Association. That's neveragainassociation.org, and please get in touch with us if you need anything else, any information from Poland, from Ukraine, from Eastern Europe, and we appreciate your solidarity and support. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I'll do likewise and mention the Institute of Race Relations website, www.irr.org.uk. But I want to tell people we do a bi-weekly newsletter, and each 2 weeks we do a thorough roundup of all developments in Europe. So that's a good way of catching up with what's going on. I'd just like to end with one last fact. As of Monday evening, the British government had granted visas to 300 Ukrainian refugees under its family scheme. 300 out of 2 million settled in the UK.
I can't even give you numbers for the US, which is ever worse in every one of these crises, I think, especially the ones they created. Thank you so much to both of you.
Thank you both very much for your time. You've been listening to Dr. Rafal Pankowski, head of the Never Again Association in Warsaw, and Liz Fekete, director of the Institute of Race Relations in London. Thank you again both very much for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Yes.